Some moments in life change everything in an instant, and some secrets we bury never truly stay buried. Samuel Cole learned this the hard way on a dusty afternoon in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, when a veiled woman collapsed at his feet, gasping for breath and begging for help. For 20 years, he'd lived alone in these mountains, keeping his distance from the troubles of the world below. He was a man of few words and simple routines, content with his solitude. But when he lifted her veil to give her air, he saw a face that made his blood run cold. It was a face from his past, one he never thought he'd see again. What she revealed in that moment would force him to confront everything he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. What was she running from, and why had she come to him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Ridge sat nestled in a valley where the Wind River Range met the high plains of Wyoming Territory, a place where the earth seemed to breathe with ancient patience. In the autumn of 1882, it was home to maybe 300 souls, give or take the seasonal workers who drifted through following cattle drives or mining prospects. The town had grown up around a trading post established 40 years prior, back when the only law was what a man could enforce with his own 2 hands and the rifle he kept close. Samuel Cole had watched the town grow from his vantage point in the mountains above, though he rarely came down except when necessity demanded it. His cabin sat at the end of a winding trail that climbed through pine and aspen, high enough that winter snows often cut him off from civilization for months at a time. He preferred it that way. The isolation suited a man who had seen enough of humanity's darker nature to appreciate the honest company of elk and eagles at 45. Samuel carried the kind of weathered strength that came from decades of hard living in unforgiving country. His face was lined and sun-darkened, his hands scarred from years of work that ranged from skinning pelts to setting broken bones, his own, mostly. He stood just over 6 feet, lean and corded with muscle, moving with the economical grace of someone who understood that wasted motion could mean the difference between life and death. When he lived alone in the high country, his hair, once dark as a raven's wing, now showed threads of silver at the temples. He kept it long enough to tie back when working, short enough that it didn't interfere with his vision. A thick beard, more gray than black these days, covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that people noticed when they bothered to look pale blue, sharp as winter ice, and carrying a depth that spoke of things seen and not forgotten. The cabin he called home was a solid structure he'd built himself over the course of 2 years, using timber from the surrounding forest and stones hauled up from the creek bed. It consisted of a single large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire space, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. Outside stood a small barn for his 2 horses, a smokehouse, and a root cellar dug into the hillside where he stored his winter provisions. His days followed, patterns established through years of solitary routine. Rise with the sun, tend the horses, check his trap lines in season, hunt when meat ran low, maintain his gear, read by lamplight in the evenings. He kept a small library. Books were one of the few luxuries he allowed himself, and a leather-bound journal where he recorded observations about weather, animal movements, and occasionally thoughts he had no one else to share with. The journal was unusual in one respect. If someone were to examine it closely, they would find that certain entries were written in a peculiar shorthand, almost a code. These entries, scattered throughout the years, contained fragments of another life, names, dates, places, incidents that Samuel had tried to document and then forget. They were the remnants of his time as a United States Marshal, a career that had ended abruptly 20 years ago under circumstances he rarely allowed himself to remember. In town, Samuel Cole was something of an enigma. The older residents remembered when he first appeared, exhausted and hollow-eyed, asking only for directions to available land in the high country. He'd paid cash for his property, declined all invitations to socialize, and made it clear he wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Over time, curiosity had faded into acceptance. He was reliable when the town needed tracking done. A lost child once, rustlers another time, and he never caused trouble. That was enough for most folks. Doc Hartley was the exception. Abraham Hartley had been practicing medicine in Cedar Ridge for 30 years, and he possessed the peculiar gift of seeing past the walls people built around themselves. He'd recognized something in Samuel from their first meeting, a parsed meeting. Kinship of men who had witnessed too much suffering and carried the weight of it quietly. Over the years, their relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship, though neither man would have used such a sentimental term. The doc made the journey up to Samuel's cabin 3 or 4 times a year, ostensibly to fish the stream that ran near the property, but really to check on a man he suspected needed checking on. They would sit on Samuel's porch, sharing whiskey and conversation that ranged from politics to philosophy, carefully avoiding any topics that delved too deep into personal history. It was a comfortable arrangement. Martha Brennan ran the general store, a position she'd inherited when her husband died of pneumonia 8 years back. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, practical and kind. With iron gray hair she wore in a simple bun and eyes that missed nothing. She treated Samuel with the same cordial efficiency she showed all her customers, never prying, always fair in her dealings. He appreciated that about her. She had a daughter, Sarah, who helped in the store, a quiet girl of 23 who had inherited her mother's steady nature. Sarah was being courted by half the young men in the county, though she seemed in no particular hurry to accept any of them. Martha approved of her daughter's caution. The frontier was hard enough without rushing into the wrong partnership. Sheriff Tom Ridley was young for the position, barely 30, appointed after the previous sheriff died of a heart attack. He'd grown up in Cedar Ridge, the son of a blacksmith, and possessed more enthusiasm than experience. He wore his badge with earnest pride and consulted Samuel on matters requiring skills he hadn't yet developed. Samuel tolerated the younger man's questions, occasionally offering advice, but maintaining the careful distance he kept from most people. Jake Morrison owned the saloon, a 2-story building that served as the town's primary gathering place for news, gossip, and the settling of debts, both financial and personal. Jake was a transplant from Kansas City, a former gambler who'd won the establishment in a poker game and decided to stay. He had a sharp eye for character and a sharper memory for details, making him an invaluable source of information about who was coming, going, and causing trouble in the territory. These were the people who formed the small circle of Samuel's acquaintance, though he would have resisted calling any of them friends, save perhaps the doc. They represented the minimal human contact he allowed himself, the thin thread connecting him to a world he'd mostly left behind. The morning of September 14th started like any other. Samuel rose before dawn, the chill air promising the approach of winter. He fed and watered his horses, a sturdy mountain mare named Molly and a younger gelding he'd acquired in trade 2 years back, then checked his supplies. He was running low on coffee, flour, and ammunition, which meant a trip to town. He'd been putting it off, but necessity had a way of overriding preference. He took his time with breakfast, frying salt pork and cornmeal mush, strong coffee brewed in a battered pot that had traveled with him from another life. Through the cabin window, he watched the sun rise over the peaks to the east, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Eagles circled on the morning thermals, hunting the meadows below. A bull elk called from somewhere in the timber, the sound echoing across the valley. There was a peace in these moments that Samuel had learned to treasure. The mountains asked nothing of him except awareness and respect. They held no judgments, harbored no expectations, and kept their secrets as well as he kept his. Up here, the past felt manageable, safely distant, a collection of scars that had faded to white lines against tan skin. But lately, something had been different. Small things easily dismissed if you weren't paying attention. Samuel paid attention. He'd noticed riders passing through town more frequently. Men who didn't quite fit the usual pattern of drifters, miners, or cowboys. They moved with purpose, asking questions, watching. 3 weeks ago, he'd spotted a pair of them studying his property from a distance, using field glasses. When he approached, they'd ridden off without explanation. Doc Hartley had mentioned it during his last visit, noting an increase in strangers asking about land prices and local residents. Probably just speculators, the DOC had said, but his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it. Still, might pay to keep your eyes open. Samuel had been keeping his eyes open for 20 years. It was a habit formed in a profession where inattention could get you killed. But the unease he felt went deeper than general caution. It was the kind of instinct that had saved his life more than once. The sense that currents were shifting, that something was moving beneath the surface of ordinary events, building toward a moment of reckoning. He tried to dismiss it as the paranoia of a man who'd spent too long alone, but the feeling persisted. And Samuel Cole had learned, through hard experience, not to ignore his instinct. Stopped by mid-morning. He'd saddled Molly and started down the trail toward Cedar Ridge. The path wound through stands of pine and aspen, across meadows where late-season wildflowers still bloomed, past the creek where he pulled more than one trout for his supper. The descent took about 90 minutes at an easy pace, and he used the time to mentally review his supply list, a mundane exercise that kept his mind occupied. The town appeared below him as he rounded the final bend, a cluster of wooden buildings arranged along a single main street, with smaller structures and houses spreading outward in no particular pattern. Smoke rose from chimneys. He could hear the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith's shop, the sound of children playing somewhere out of sight. Normal, ordinary, safe. But as he rode down into Cedar Ridge that afternoon, the September sun beating down from a cloudless sky, Samuel Cole couldn't shake the feeling that normalcy was about to shatter like glass under a hammer blow. He didn't know why, couldn't point to any specific evidence beyond the tension that had settled between his shoulder blades, like a hand pressed against his spine. He just knew that something was coming, and whatever it was, it would change everything. Samuel tied Molly to the hitching post outside Martha Brennan's general store, taking a moment to survey the street before entering. The afternoon heat pressed down on Cedar Ridge like a weight unusual for September. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the occasional wagon wheel or passing horse. The town felt subdued, slower than normal, as if waiting for something to break the tension. Inside the store, Martha greeted him with her customary efficiency. "Mr. Cole, your monthly visit, right on schedule, ma'am." Samuel handed her his list, written in careful block letters. "If you could put this together, I'll settle up and be on my way." Martha studied the list, nodding. "Should take me about 20 minutes. Coffee's fresh if you want to wait inside where it's cooler." Samuel accepted the offer, pouring himself a cup from the pot Martha kept on the stove. The store smelled of leather, tobacco, and the various spices and dried goods that lined the shelves. Sarah Brennan was in the back, organizing bolts of fabric. She offered him a polite nod, which he returned. He was halfway through his coffee when the commotion started outside. Raised voices, the sound of someone stumbling, a woman's cry cut short by what might have been a cough or sob. Samuel set down his cup and moved to the door. A crowd had gathered near the entrance to Jake Morrison's saloon, about 30 yards down the street. Samuel could see a figure in black, a woman, judging by the dress swaying unsteadily. People were keeping their distance, the way frontier folk did when confronted with something they didn't understand. Strangers could bring trouble or disease, and caution was bred deep in people who lived hard lives on the edge of civilization. The woman took 2 more steps and collapsed. Samuel was moving before. He made a conscious decision, crossing the distance in long strides. The crowd parted for him, recognizing his authority, even though he held no official position. Up close, he could see she wore a traveling dress of good quality, but covered in dust, as if she'd ridden hard and far. A black veil hung from her hat, obscuring her face completely. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, each one seeming to cost her tremendous effort. "Give her space," Samuel said, his voice carrying the quiet command of someone used to being obeyed. He knelt beside her, assessing. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her hand clutched at his sleeve, surprisingly strong despite her obvious distress. "Can't breathe." The words came out strangled, desperate. The veil was the problem, Samuel realized. Heavy black fabric pressed against her nose and mouth, already compromised by whatever had driven her to exhaustion. Without thinking about propriety or permission, he reached for the veil's fastening. "Easy now," he said gently. "I'm going to lift this so you can get some air." His fingers found the pins holding the veil in place. He removed them carefully, then lifted the black fabric away from her face. Time seemed to stop. The face looking up at him was thinner than he remembered, lined with years of hardship he could only imagine, marked by fading bruises along the jawline and a scar that ran from her left temple to her cheekbone. But the eyes were the same dark brown, intelligent, and in this moment, filled with recognition and fear in equal measure. Elizabeth Caldwell, James's wife, dead for 20 years. Samuel's hands went numb. The veil slipped from his fingers, falling to the dust. His mind fractured into 1,000 pieces, each one screaming a different impossibility. She was dead. He'd seen the burned cabin, seen the bodies, too charred to identify clearly, but the Marshal Service had confirmed it. Elizabeth and James, killed in an ambush while investigating land fraud in the Montana Territory. Samuel had been 3 hours away, delayed by a washed-out bridge, arriving too late to save them. He'd carried that guilt for 2 decades, and now she was alive, lying in the dust of Cedar Ridge, looking at him like she'd seen a ghost, though he felt like he was the one seeing phantoms. Samuel. His name on her lips, barely a whisper. Then, louder, urgent. "They're coming for me. They know I'm alive." Before he could respond, something fell from her neck, a thin chain with a locket. It landed in the dust beside her, gold glinting in the harsh sunlight. Samuel picked it up automatically, his marshal's instincts cataloging details even through his shock. The locket was old, well-worn, with initials engraved on the front. E.C. Elizabeth Caldwell. "Doc." Samuel's voice cracked like a whip across the street. "I need Doc Hartley. Now." Someone ran. Samuel barely noticed. He was staring at Elizabeth, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow gasps, seeing the way her eyes tracked past him to scan the street, the fear that tightened her features. "You're safe," he heard himself say, though he had no idea if it was true. "I've got you." Doc Hartley arrived at a run, medical bag in hand. He took one look at Elizabeth and immediately began his examination, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing, peeling back an eyelid to check her pupils. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of decades of practice. "Dehydration, exhaustion, possible heat stroke," the doc muttered. "How long has she been traveling?" "I don't know." Samuel's voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and hollow. Sheriff Ridley pushed through the crowd, young face creased with concern and official responsibility. "What's going on here? Who is she?" Samuel met the sheriff's eyes and made a decision in that split second. A woman in trouble. That's all that matters right now. She say what kind of trouble? Not yet. Samuel stood, using his height to full advantage, placing himself between Ridley and Elizabeth in a gesture that was pure protection. Doc needs to tend to her first. Questions can wait. Ridley looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Samuel's expression stopped him. The younger man nodded slowly. "All right, but I'll need answers eventually, Mr. Cole. You'll get them." Doc Hartley had produced a canteen and was helping Elizabeth drink small sips, coaching her to go slow. Color was returning to her face, the panicked breathing easing to something more regular. Her eyes never left Samuel's face. "She needs rest, fluids, and a proper examination," Doc said. "I can take her to my office." "No." Samuel surprised himself with the vehemence of his response. "She comes with me. To my cabin." Doc raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He knew Samuel well enough to recognize when the man had made up his mind. "Then help me get her on her feet." Slowly now. They lifted Elizabeth between them, supporting her weight as she found her balance. She was lighter than she should be, Samuel noted. Too thin, carrying the hollowed-out look of someone who'd been running on determination alone for far too long. The crowd was still watching, curiosity burning in every face. Samuel swept his gaze across them, his expression making it clear that questions would not be welcome. Most people looked away. Cedar Ridge had learned to respect Samuel Cole's privacy, and they extended that courtesy to those under his protection. But not everyone was cowed. Samuel's attention caught on three men standing outside the saloon, watching with an intensity that set his instincts screaming. They weren't locals. He'd noticed them earlier in the week, passing through, asking Jake Morrison questions about land prices and long-term residents. Now they watched Elizabeth with the focus of hunting wolves who just spotted their prey. One of them, a lean man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, met Samuel's stare and smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. Samuel filed the image away, committing every detail to memory. Later, he would deal with whoever had put that fear in Elizabeth's eyes. But first, he needed to get her somewhere safe. Martha Brennan appeared with his supplies already packed and tied. "On the house today," she said quietly. "Take care of her, Mr. Cole." He nodded his thanks, unable to form words. With Doc's help, Samuel got Elizabeth onto Molly's back, then swung up behind her. She sagged against him immediately, exhausted beyond endurance. He could feel her trembling, whether from fear or physical strain, he couldn't tell. Maybe both. "Hold on," he murmured. "We'll be there soon." As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Samuel glanced back once. The three strangers were still watching, and one of them had produced a small notebook. Writing something down, Samuel touched his heels to Molly's flanks, urging her to a faster pace. His mind was racing, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. Elizabeth Caldwell was alive. She'd found him after 20 years. Someone was hunting her. And the gold locket pressed against his chest, tucked into his shirt pocket, felt like it weighed more than all the guilt he'd been carrying since the day he thought she died. Questions could wait. Right now, all that mattered was getting her to safety and finding out what had brought a ghost back from the dead and what it would cost both of them to keep her alive. The journey to the cabin passed in a blur of sensation and fractured thought. Samuel felt Elizabeth's weight against his chest, heard her breathing gradually steady, smelled the dust and sweat of hard travel on her clothes. His mind kept circling back to the impossibility of her presence, trying to reconcile memory with reality and failing at every turn. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the climb, sometimes murmuring words he couldn't quite catch, other times going rigid with what looked like remembered fear. He kept one arm locked around her waist, holding her secure, while the other hand guided Molly up the familiar trail with the unconscious skill of long practice. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they finally reached the cabin. Samuel dismounted first, then carefully lifted Elizabeth down. Her eyes opened as her feet touched the ground, unfocused and confused. "Where you're safe," Samuel said. "My home. No one knows about this place except Doc and a handful of others. You can rest here." She nodded, too exhausted to question further. He helped her inside, settling her on his own bed in the loft, the only proper sleeping place in the cabin. She was unconscious again before he'd finished removing her boots, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she'd been fighting. Samuel stood there for a long moment, just watching her breathe. In sleep, the fear smoothed from her features, and he could see traces of the woman he'd known 20 years ago. Elizabeth had been James's wife. Yes, but before that, she'd been a friend to both of them. A woman of sharp intelligence and quiet courage who'd chosen to stand beside her husband, even when his work as a marshal took them into dangerous territory. Samuel had loved her once, though he'd never said the words aloud. James had been his partner, his closest friend, and you didn't covet your friend's wife no matter what your heart whispered in the dark hours of night. He buried those feelings along with everything else the day he thought she died. And now here she was, alive, carrying bruises that spoke of violence and fear that ran bone deep. Someone had hurt her. Someone was hunting her. And Samuel felt a cold rage building in his chest that he recognized from his marshal days, the kind of anger that made dangerous men cautious and smart men. Careful, he climbed back down from the loft and began the practical work of caring for an unexpected guest. First, he tended to Molly, unsaddling her and making sure she had feed and water. Then he brought Elizabeth's saddlebag inside, setting it near the door. It was lighter than it should be for someone traveling any real distance, suggesting she'd left in a hurry with minimal supplies. The bag's weight nagged at him. Samuel had spent too many years as a lawman not to recognize when something felt wrong. After a moment's hesitation aware he was violating her privacy, but unable to ignore his instincts, he opened it. Inside, a change of clothes, some basic toiletries, a small amount of money. And at the bottom, folded carefully, a piece of paper that made his blood run cold. It was a wanted poster. Printed on cheap paper, but official-looking enough. The face rendered in crude woodcut was recognizably Elizabeth's, though the name beneath it read Margaret Sutton. The charges: murder and theft. The reward: $10,000, dead or alive. Issued by Clayton Voss, identified as a rancher and businessman operating out of Cheyenne. The poster was dated 6 months ago. Samuel read it 3 times, committing every detail to memory. The specific charges were vague: murder of John Hastings and theft of property and documents. No specifics about when or where these crimes supposedly occurred. That vagueness bothered him. Legitimate wanted posters included details. This felt personal, real, like someone using the trappings of law to pursue a private vendetta. The name Voss stirred something in his memory. Clayton Voss. He turned it over in his mind, reaching back through 20 years of trying to forget. There had been a Voss involved in the land fraud case that had gotten James killed. Silas Voss, a wealthy rancher using intimidation and violence to force settlers off valuable grazing land. James had been gathering evidence, building a case. Then came the ambush, the fire, the bodies. Clayton would be about the right age to be Silas's son, which meant this wasn't a coincidence. Elizabeth's reappearance, the poster, the men watching her in town, it was all connected to that old case. To whatever had happened the night James died. Samuel carefully refolded the poster and placed it back in the saddlebag. His hands were steady, but inside he felt something shifting, realigning. For 20 years he'd been running from his past, hiding in these mountains, telling himself he'd left the marshal's life behind. But the past had just walked back into his world wearing Elizabeth Caldwell's face, and he couldn't ignore it any more than he could ignore his own heartbeat. He made coffee and sat at his table, watching the light fade outside his window. Questions multiplied in his mind, each one spawning 3 more. Why had everyone believed Elizabeth died? Where had she been for 20 years? What had she allegedly stolen that was worth $10,000? And most importantly, why come to him now, after all this time? Full dark had fallen when he heard movement from the loft. He looked up to see Elizabeth sitting on the edge of the bed, silhouetted against the window behind her. How long was I asleep? Her voice was hoarse but steady. Few hours. There's water beside the bed, and food if you're hungry. He heard her drink, the sound of the dipper scraping the bucket. Then silence, stretching out until it became almost uncomfortable. You found the poster. Not a question. Yes. You want to know if it's true. Samuel considered his answer carefully. I want to know what happened. The truth, Elizabeth. All of it. She climbed down from the loft, moving stiffly, favoring her right side. In the lamplight, he could see more details he'd missed before. The way she held herself, like someone expecting a blow. The calculating wariness in her eyes as she assessed her surroundings, cataloging exits and potential weapons. These were survivors' habits, learned through hard experience. She sat across from him at the table. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Two people separated by 20 years and a gulf of unanswered questions. I did kill someone, Elizabeth said finally. 6 months ago. One of Clayton Vuss's men. He found me in a town called Rollins, trying to drag me back. I fought him off. He fell, hit his head. It was self-defense, but there were no witnesses who testified to that. Voss owns half the town. And the theft charge? More complicated. She wrapped her hands around the cup of water he'd poured for her. Samuel, before I explain any of this, I need you to tell me something. Does James... Her voice cracked. Does James know I'm alive? The pain in her eyes nearly broke him. Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the tremor running through her fingers. James died that night, Elizabeth. 20 years ago. Whatever happened, he didn't survive it. I'm sorry. The sound she made wasn't quite a sob, more like something breaking deep inside her chest. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't try to stop them. Samuel held her hand and let her grieve, understanding that whatever story she was about to tell, it started with a loss neither of them had fully processed. When she finally spoke again, her voice was raw but determined. Then you need to know everything, because the man who killed James is still out there, and his son is the one hunting me now. Morning came cold and clear, frost crystallizing on the cabin windows in delicate patterns. Samuel woke from troubled sleep on the floor near the fireplace, his body protesting the hard surface. He'd given Elizabeth the bed without question, keeping watch through most of the night. His old service revolver within easy reach. She was already awake when he stirred, sitting at the table with a cup of the coffee he'd prepared the night before. She looked better cleaner, having used the wash basin and changed into fresh clothes from her saddlebag. But the shadows under her eyes spoke of sleep that hadn't come or hadn't stayed. Samuel set about making breakfast, falling into the familiar rhythm of cabin life. Bacon sizzling in the pan, cornbread warming on the stove, eggs gathered from the 3 chickens he kept in a coop behind the barn. The domestic routine felt strange with another person present, intimate in a way that made him acutely aware of 20 years of solitude. You keep a nice home, Elizabeth said quietly. James used to talk about how organized you were. He said you could set up a camp in hostile territory and make it feel like a hotel. Samuel cracked eggs into the pan. James exaggerated. Not about you. He didn't. She paused. He trusted you more than anyone, including me sometimes. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Samuel divided the food onto 2 plates and brought them to the table. They ate in silence for a while, both of them navigating the awkwardness of shared space and shared history. Finally, Elizabeth set down her fork. You deserve the whole story. From the beginning. Samuel nodded, settling back in his chair. I'm listening. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like it could anchor her to the present. You remember the Silas Voss case? The land fraud investigation. I remember. Settlers being forced off prime grazing land, intimidation, violence. James thought Voss had bought off local law enforcement. That's why the Marshal Service got involved. It was worse than that. Elizabeth's voice took on a distant quality, like she was seeing events from long ago. I witnessed a murder, Samuel. Saw Silas Voss shoot a homesteader named Thomas Riley in cold blood because Riley refused to sell. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, had ridden out to check on Mrs. Riley, who'd been sick. I saw it through their cabin window. Samuel felt ice forming in his gut. James knew? I told him immediately. We both knew it changed everything. A marshal's wife as an eyewitness to murder. That's hard evidence. The kind that could hang a man like Voss, regardless of how much influence he had. She took a shaky breath. We met with you and the other marshals to plan how to handle it. You remember that night? He did, a week before the ambush. They'd gathered in a line shack 20 miles from Voss's main ranch, discussing strategy. The plan had been to get Elizabeth somewhere safe while they gathered additional evidence and coordinated with the territorial authorities. Samuel had volunteered to escort her to Miles City, but James insisted on doing it himself. You and James were going to take me to safety, Elizabeth continued. But Voss found out. I don't know how bribed someone, intercepted a message, just got lucky. But he knew. The night you were supposed to meet us at the staging point, the bridge was washed out, Samuel said. Flash flood from upstream. By the time I found another crossing, it was dawn. Too late for James. Elizabeth's voice broke. They came just after midnight. 8 men, heavily armed. James fought them. God, he fought so hard, but we were outnumbered. They burned the cabin to cover the evidence. I tried to stay with him, but one of Voss's men, a scarred bastard named Pike, grabbed me, dragged me away. Samuel's hands clenched into fists on the table. The bodies we found, a trapper and his wife, probably, already dead when Voss's men got there. Pike told me later they'd killed them days before, held them in case they needed to stage something. They dressed them in our clothes, made sure the fire would burn hot enough to make identification difficult. The calculation of it, the cold-blooded planning, made Samuel's stomach turn. Why keep you alive? Insurance. Voss wanted to know what evidence we had, where it was hidden, who else knew. He couldn't risk killing me until he was sure there were no other witnesses, no documentation that could surface later. She met Samuel's eyes. They kept me prisoner at Voss's ranch for 14 months. In a root cellar, mostly. Moved me occasionally when they thought someone might be getting suspicious. Samuel had to look away. The thought of Elizabeth locked in darkness, alone, terrified. While he'd been mourning her death just miles away in these same mountains, it was almost too much to bear. How did you escape? I got careless. He'd been put in charge of guarding me, and he liked to drink. One night he passed out with the keys still in his belt. I took them, stole a horse, and ran. Didn't stop running until I reached the Montana border. She touched the scar on her temple. Got this when the horse threw me crossing a stream. Nearly died of exposure that winter. Where did you go? Everywhere. Nowhere. I changed my name first to Mary Sullivan, then Margaret Sutton when I heard Voss's men were asking about Mary. Worked whatever jobs would hire a woman with no references. Laundry, cooking, sewing. Moved every few months. Never stayed long enough to form attachments. Her voice was flat, reciting facts rather than feelings. I learned Silas Voss died 5 years ago. I thought maybe it was over. But then his son Clayton found me. Samuel pulled James's marshal badge from his pocket. He'd retrieved it from the wall the night before. Unable to sleep with it staring at him, he set it on the table between them. Elizabeth reached out and touched it with one finger, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. James made me promise something, Samuel said quietly. If anything ever happened to him, he made me swear I'd look after you, make sure you were safe. You thought I was dead. I did. But you're not. And a promise is a promise, Elizabeth. I won't let Voss's son hurt you. Whatever it takes. She looked up at him, searching his face. You don't understand what you're offering. Clayton Voss is worse than his father. Smarter, more ruthless, and completely obsessed with eliminating anyone who knows about the family's crimes. He has money, men, and connections. Going against him, I've gone against worse. Have you? She picked up the badge, turning it over in her hands. Because I've been running from him for 6 months, and he's never more than a few steps behind. He won't stop, Samuel. Not until I'm dead or he is. A knock at the door interrupted them, sharp and unexpected. Samuel was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand, positioning himself between Elizabeth and the door. Samuel, it's Doc Hartley, and I'm not alone. We need to talk. Samuel exchanged a glance with Elizabeth, saw her nod slightly. He opened the door to find Doc Hartley standing with Sheriff Ridley. Both men looked grim. What's wrong? Doc held up a rolled piece of paper. You need to see this. And then we all need to figure out what the hell we're going to do about it. Doc Hartley spread the map across Samuel's table, weighing down the corners with coffee cups. It was a detailed survey map of the Cedar Ridge Valley and surrounding territory, marked with careful annotations in multiple colors of ink. Red circles covered most of the valley floor. Blue lines traced water sources. Green marks indicated something else. Samuel wasn't sure what until Doc explained. Martha Brennan's brother-in-law sent this from the land office in Cheyenne, Doc said. He's a clerk there, sees all the property transfers. These red circles? All land purchased by Clayton Voss or his holding companies in the past 18 months. Samuel studied the map, his tactical mind automatically analyzing the pattern. Voss had been systematic, acquiring properties in a ring around the valley, steadily tightening the noose. Small parcels, family farms, grazing land, all bought at prices that seemed fair on paper, but couldn't have been refused without consequences. He's circling us, Sheriff Ridley said, stating the obvious but looking troubled by it. My family's blacksmith shop is here. He pointed to a blue mark near the town center. We've had 2 offers in the past year, each one higher than the last. My father keeps refusing. The green marks, Samuel said. What are those? Properties Voss doesn't own yet but seems interested in. Doc pointed to several scattered locations. And this one. His finger came to rest on a mark high in the mountains. That's your land, Samuel. The cabin sat at the head of the valley, controlling access to the primary water source that fed into the streams and creeks below. Samuel had chosen the location 20 years ago precisely because of its strategic importance. Though his thinking then had been defensive, a place that could be easily defended and hard to reach. Now he saw what Voss saw. Whoever controlled that land controlled water access for the entire valley during the dry season. He wants it all, Elizabeth said softly. She'd moved to stand beside Samuel, studying the map with the intensity of someone who'd learned to recognize patterns of predatory behavior. It's the same strategy his father used. Buy up everything around a target, squeeze until they have no choice but to sell or be forced out. But why? Ridley asked. Cedar Ridge isn't exactly prime territory. We're too remote for easy railroad access. The soil's only mediocre for farming, and the winters are hard. What's worth all this effort? Water, Samuel said, and the land rights that come with it. The territory's growing. Give it another decade, maybe 2, and this valley becomes valuable. Rail lines will extend, mines will open in the surrounding mountains. Whoever controls the water and the access routes controls everything else. Doc nodded grimly. Clayton Voss isn't thinking about next year. He's thinking about the next generation. His father taught him to play a long game. There's more, Doc added, pulling out a folded newspaper from his coat pocket. This came up on yesterday's stage from Cheyenne. The newspaper was a week old, but the article Doc pointed to made Samuel's jaw tighten. It reported that a respected businessman named Clayton Voss had petitioned that territorial governor, for assistance in apprehending a dangerous fugitive a woman wanted for murder who was believed to be hiding in the Cedar Ridge area. The article praised Voss's civic responsibility and his generous offer of a reward for information leading to the fugitive's capture. "He's making it legal," Elizabeth said, her voice hollow, "using the law to hunt me." "He's doing more than that," Ridley said. "This morning, just before we rode up here, a territorial marshal arrived in town. Name's Dixon. He's got a proper warrant for your arrest, ma'am, for the murder of John Hastings and theft of documents pertaining to private business matters." Samuel's mind raced. Dixon's in Voss's pocket. Maybe. Or maybe he's just a lawman doing his job based on what he's been told. Ridley looked uncomfortable. Either way, he's asking questions. So far I've been vague about who I saw yesterday, but he's not stupid. Someone will tell him about a woman in black, and when they do, he'll want to search for her. Then we don't have much time, Doc said. "Samuel, I know you want to protect her, but we need to think this through. If Voss has the law on his side, fighting him directly could make things worse." Elizabeth moved to the window, staring out at the mountains. "You should turn me in, all of you. This isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't," Samuel said, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "James was my partner, my friend, and Voss killed him. That makes it personal. James died 20 years ago. What good does it do to? You think time makes murder acceptable?" Samuel crossed to stand beside her. "You think there's a statute of limitations on justice?" "I think you've built a life here," Elizabeth said quietly. "A peaceful life. I won't let you destroy it for a ghost." "You're not a ghost. You're standing right here, alive, and someone's trying to kill you for telling the truth about a crime you witnessed." He turned to Doc and Ridley. "She didn't murder anyone. She defended herself against a man trying to kidnap her. And the documents she supposedly stole, they're evidence of Silas Voss's crimes. Evidence that could bring down his son." Ridley's eyebrows rose. "You have this evidence?" Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "Hidden in a bank deposit box in Cheyenne under a false name. Documentation of everything Silas Voss did 20 years ago, plus what I've been able to gather on Clayton over the past few months. Murder, land fraud, witness intimidation, enough to hang him a dozen times over if it ever reaches an honest judge." "Then that's our play," Samuel said. "We get that evidence, we take it to the territorial authorities, people above Voss's influence, and we end this." "It's not that simple," Elizabeth protested. "Cheyenne is 200 miles from here. Voss has men everywhere. The moment we try to retrieve those documents, then we'll have to be smarter than his men." Samuel looked at Doc and Ridley. "Are you in?" Doc didn't hesitate. "I've been a doctor in this territory for 30 years. I've seen what men like Voss do to good people who get in their way. I watched families broken, lives destroyed. Also, some rich bastard could add another zero to his bank account. Yes, I'm in." Ridley was quiet longer, clearly wrestling with the decision. He was young, ambitious, and this could end his career before it truly began. But Samuel could see the moment he made his choice, saw the boy become a man in the space of a breath. "My father always said the badge means something, or it means nothing." Ridley straightened. "I'm in. But we do this smart. We can't just run off half-cocked. We need a plan." "Agreed," Samuel said. "First step, we find out exactly what Marshal Dixon knows and who's feeding him information. Second, we figure out how to get to Cheyenne without Voss's men catching us." Third, the sound of horses approaching cut him off. Multiple riders coming fast up the mountain trail. Samuel moved to the window, calculating distance and numbers. 4 men, heavily armed, with one rider in front who sat his horse like someone used to authority. "That'll be Dixon," Ridley said, peering over Samuel's shoulder. "He must have convinced someone to guide him up here." And those 3 men behind him were in town yesterday, Samuel finished, watching when Elizabeth collapsed. "This is my fault," Elizabeth said. "I led them right to you." Samuel loaded his rifle with swift, practiced movements. No, this was always going to happen. Voss wasn't going to leave any loose ends, and I was one of them. I just didn't realize it until now. "Samuel, Doc, take Elizabeth out the back. There's a trail that leads to the old mining camp about 3 miles north. You remember it?" "I remember. Wait there. I'll deal with Dixon and his friends." "You can't fight a territorial marshal," Ridley said. "That's prison at minimum, hanging at worst. I don't plan to fight him. I plan to talk to him, but I want Elizabeth somewhere safe while I do it." Samuel met her eyes. "Trust me." Please. Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before nodding. Doc took her arm and guided her toward the back door while Samuel and Ridley moved to the front porch. The riders were close enough now that Samuel could make out individual features. Marshal Dixon was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a handlebar mustache and eyes that missed nothing. The 3 men behind him were the same ones from town, including the lean one with the scarred eyebrow. Dixon reined in his horse at a respectful distance, hand resting on his sidearm but not drawing. A professional, then. That could work in Samuel's favor or against it, depending on how deep Voss's influence ran. "Samuel Cole?" Dixon's voice carried the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. "That's right. I'm Marshal Thomas Dixon, Territorial Service. I have some questions about a woman who was seen in Cedar Ridge yesterday. Witnesses say she left town in your company. I helped a woman who was in distress. Gave her water. Made sure she was safe. That a crime now? Depends on the woman." Dixon shifted in his saddle. "The one I'm looking for is wanted for murder. Goes by several names, most recently Margaret Sutton. About 35, dark hair, dark eyes. Ring any bells?" "I helped a woman who was struggling to breathe. Didn't catch her name and didn't think to ask for papers." Samuel kept his voice level, conversational. "She rested here for a few hours, then moved on. Headed north, I believe." It wasn't exactly a lie. Doc and Elizabeth were heading north to the old mining camp, just not as far north as he was implying. Dixon studied him for a long moment. "You wouldn't be obstructing justice, would you, Mr. Cole?" "Wouldn't dream of it, Marshal." The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "He's lying, Dixon. I saw him take her out of town yesterday. She's here somewhere. Pike, isn't it?" Samuel said mildly, recognizing the name Elizabeth had mentioned. "You work for Clayton Voss." Pike's hand moved to his gun. "What of it?" "Just wondering why a territorial marshal is riding with private hired guns instead of proper deputies." Samuel directed the question to Dixon. "That standard procedure these days?" Dixon's jaw tightened. "Mr. Voss has been instrumental in providing information about the fugitive. His men know her by sight. Made sense to bring them along. Or maybe Voss is using you to settle a personal score." Samuel let the words hang in the air. "You ever wonder why a rich rancher cares so much about one woman that he'd offer $10,000 for her capture? That seem like justice to you, or does it smell more like revenge?" "The charges are legitimate," Dixon said, but Samuel heard the faint note of uncertainty. "Are they? What exactly did Margaret Sutton, or whatever name she's using, supposedly steal? And who did she supposedly murder?" "That's not your concern, Mr. Cole." "It is if you're asking me to turn over someone who came to me for help." Samuel descended the porch steps slowly, hands visible and away from his weapons. "I served as a U.S. Marshal myself, 20 years back. I know how this works. You get a warrant, you serve it, you bring in the fugitive for trial. But I also know that warrants can be bought, testimony can be fabricated, and justice can be twisted to serve the interests of whoever has the deepest pockets." Pike swung down from his horse, his hand still on his gun. "Enough talk. Dixon, we're searching this cabin. You have a search warrant?" Ridley spoke up for the first time, moving to stand beside Samuel, because without one, you're trespassing on private property. Who the hell are you? Pike demanded. Tom Ridley, Sheriff of Cedar Ridge, and I'm telling you that without proper paperwork, you've got no authority here. Dixon looked between them, clearly calculating his options. Pike, stand down. The sheriff's right. He addressed Samuel again. I can get a warrant if I need to, but I'd rather we handle this the easy way. If the woman's not here, then you've got nothing to worry about. Let us take a quick look around, satisfy ourselves that you're being straight with us, and we'll be on our way. It was a reasonable request, and refusing it would only make Samuel look guilty. He considered his options quickly. Doc and Elizabeth had a 10-minute head start, enough to reach the first bend in the trail where the thick pine cover would hide them from view. Even if Dixon searched now, he'd find nothing. All right, Samuel said, but just you, Marshal. Your hired friends stay outside. Pike started to protest, but Dixon raised a hand. Agreed. Pike, you and the others wait here. He dismounted and followed Samuel into the cabin. The search was thorough but professional. Dixon checked the loft, examined the supply shelves, even glanced into the root cellar access. But there was nothing to find Elizabeth's saddlebag had gone with her, and Samuel had been careful to remove any signs of her presence. The only thing that might have given them away was the 2 coffee cups on the table. But Samuel had anticipated that and set out a third earlier, making it look like Doc and Ridley had been visiting. Satisfied? Samuel asked when Dixon finished. The marshal stood in the center of the cabin, looking around one more time. Where's Doc Hartley? Headed back to town. He's got patients to check on. And the woman you helped yesterday? Told you. She rested, then moved on. Could be 20 miles from here by now in any direction. Dixon studied Samuel's face with the intensity of someone trained to detect lies. Samuel met his gaze steadily, using every bit of control he'd learned as a marshal himself. Finally, Dixon nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Cole. I believe you're telling me what you know. But I'll be watching the roads and trails. If this woman surfaces again, I expect you to notify me immediately. If she's guilty of murder, absolutely, Samuel said. But if she's innocent and just running from someone powerful who wants her dead, well, that's a different situation entirely. Dixon's expression flickered, there and gone. But Samuel caught it. Doubt. The marshal wasn't entirely comfortable with this assignment. Marshal, can I ask you something? Samuel kept his voice low as they walked back outside. How well do you know Clayton Voss? Met him once. Seemed like a solid citizen. And his father, Silas? Dead before my time in this territory. Why? Because 20 years ago, Silas Voss ordered the murder of a U.S. Marshal named James Caldwell. I know, because I was Caldwell's partner. We were investigating Voss for land fraud and intimidation. Caldwell died in an ambush, along with his wife. The case was closed as an unfortunate incident bandits, they said. But it wasn't bandits. It was Voss's hired guns. Dixon stopped walking. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. And I'm betting the woman you're looking for knows things about the Voss family that could hang Clayton just like his father should have been hanged. That's why he wants her dead, not because she committed any crime. You have proof of any of this? Not yet, but I know where to get it. Dixon was quiet for a long moment, weighing Samuel's words. Finally, he said, even if what you're saying is true, I have a warrant. I have to serve it. I understand, but maybe you take your time serving it. Give me a chance to bring you real evidence. How much time? A week. I can give you 3 days. After that, I have to report back to Cheyenne, and I won't be able to hold off the pressure from Voss. Dixon glanced toward where Pike and the others waited. And I'd be careful, Mr. Cole. Those men aren't lawmen. They're killers, and they won't wait for warrants or trials if they get the chance. Samuel nodded. Appreciated, Marshal. Dixon mounted his horse and gathered his reins. 3 days, Cole. Don't make me regret this. They rode out, Pike shooting venomous looks back at the cabin. Samuel watched until they disappeared down the trail, then turned to Ridley. You think he'll keep his word? Ridley asked. For 3 days, yes. He's a lawman, not a hired gun. He'll follow the rules as long as he can. Samuel moved back into the cabin, already forming plans. But Pike won't. Those three will be watching the trails, looking for any sign of Elizabeth. Which means we need to move fast. What's the play? Samuel pulled out the map Doc had left behind, studying the routes to Cheyenne. We go tonight. Take the high passes harder traveling, but less chance of running into Voss's men. Doc and Elizabeth are waiting at the mining camp. We pick them up, then push hard for Cheyenne. That's 200 miles of rough country. I know, but we don't have a choice. 3 days isn't enough time to plan something better. Samuel began gathering supplies, ammunition, dried food, extra canteens. Go back to town. Tell Martha what's happening. We'll need supplies for 4 people, and we'll need them quietly. Can you arrange that? Martha will help. She's no friend of Voss. Her husband died fighting land grabbers 10 years back. Same pattern as what's happening now. Ridley headed for the door, then stopped. Samuel, one more thing. That compass on your shelf, the silver one with the inscription. That belonged to James Caldwell, didn't it? Samuel looked at the compass, reading the familiar words engraved on its back. True north, always. James gave it to me when we became partners. Said a good lawman always needed to know which direction he was heading, both literally and morally. Seems like you remember that lesson. Ridley touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. I'll be back before dark with supplies. After Ridley left, Samuel stood alone in his cabin, the compass in his hand. For 20 years, he'd kept it as a reminder of friendship, of loss, of a life he'd left behind. Now it felt like a call back to that life, a reminder that some debts could never be repaid, but had to be honored. Nonetheless, he pocketed the compass and gathered the rest of what they'd need. As the sun began its descent toward evening, he locked the cabin door and headed up the trail to the old mining camp where Doc and Elizabeth waited. It was time to stop running and start fighting back. The old mining camp sat in a narrow valley carved by ancient glaciers, surrounded by pine forest dense enough to hide a small army. Samuel approached carefully, using hand signals Doc would recognize from their years of knowing each other. A low whistle answered him from the largest remaining structure, a half-collapsed bunkhouse that somehow still kept out most of the weather. Elizabeth and Doc were inside, a small fire burning in what remained of the stone fireplace. They'd been talking quietly when Samuel entered, and he noticed how Elizabeth's hand had moved instinctively to the knife at her belt before recognizing him. Survival reflexes, learned through hard years. Dixon bought it, Samuel said without preamble. We've got 3 days before he has to report back. But Pike and Voss's other men won't wait that long. We leave tonight for Cheyenne. Elizabeth stood, brushing dust from her skirt. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is foolish. The journey alone is dangerous. I know. Samuel pulled out the map. But we'll take the high passes, stay off the main trails. It'll be harder going, but safer. Safer? Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. Samuel, you don't know Clayton Voss like I do. He's not his father. He's worse. Smarter, more patient, and absolutely ruthless. He'll have men watching every approach to Cheyenne. Then we'll find a way around them. There is no way around them. Her voice rose, frustration and fear bleeding through. For 6 months, I've been trying to stay ahead of him. I've changed names, changed routes, never stayed anywhere more than a few weeks. And he still found me. He always finds me. Doc cleared his throat gently. Maybe that's worth thinking about, Samuel. How did Voss track her to Cedar Ridge? It's not exactly on any main routes. Samuel had been wondering the same thing. You used any particular pattern in choosing where to go? Elizabeth shook her head. I deliberately avoided patterns. Random towns, random directions. I thought. She stopped, her expression shifting from frustration to realization. The bank. What bank? In Cheyenne, where I stored the documents. She sank back onto the rough wooden bench. I've been checking on them. Not often, maybe once every 3 or 4 months. But I needed to make sure they were still safe, that the box hadn't been opened or tampered with. And Voss has someone watching the bank, Samuel said, understanding. Every time you showed up, they spotted you, tracked where you went afterward. Which means going to Cheyenne is walking right into his trap. Elizabeth put her head in her hands. I've been leading him to everyone who helps me. Everyone I've put at risk. Stop. Samuel crouched in front of her, waiting until she looked at him. You survived. That's what matters. And now we use what we know to turn his advantage against him. How? We make him think he's won. Make him believe he knows exactly what we're going to do. Then do something else. Samuel's mind was already working through possibilities, falling back into the tactical thinking that had made him a successful marshal. Doc, you said Martha's brother-in-law works at the land office in Cheyenne? That's right. Henry Brennan. Good man, honest as they come. Can you get word to him? Something that won't be intercepted? Doc considered. There's a freight hauler who runs between here and Cheyenne twice a month. He's reliable and discreet. Goes through tomorrow. Perfect. Send word that we're coming in 3 days. Give him our route, the works. Make it look like we're trusting him with sensitive information. Elizabeth caught on quickly. You're going to leak it. Make sure Voss finds out. Right. He'll set his ambush along that route, deploy his men where he thinks we'll be. Samuel traced a different path on the map. Meanwhile, we go this way. Through the Absaroka Range, down through the Wind River Canyon. It's rougher terrain, no real trails in places, but if we move fast, we can reach Cheyenne from the west while Voss is watching the north. That's a hell of a gamble, Doc said. If something goes wrong, then we're no worse off than we are now. Samuel looked at Elizabeth. Unless you have a better idea. She studied the map, her finger tracing the route he'd indicated. It could work, but we'd need to move at night in some places, stay off any established paths. And we'd need supplies for at least 5 days, maybe 6 if the weather turns. Ridley's handling that. He'll be back before dark with everything we need. You trust him? Elizabeth asked. How well do you know him? It was a fair question from someone who'd learned the hard way that trust could kill you. Not well, but he's got integrity. I've seen it in how he handles himself, how the town respects him, and he stood up to Marshal Dixon for us. That counts for something. Unless he's playing a longer game, Elizabeth said softly. Unless Voss got to him months ago, and this whole thing is just Ridley getting us to lead him exactly where Voss wants us. The possibility sent cold fingers down Samuel's spine. It fit too well. Ridley's convenient appearance at the cabin, his quick agreement to help, his access to information about Voss's land purchases. If he was feeding information to Voss, they were walking blind into whatever trap had been prepared. There's one way to find out, Doc said. Test him. Give him false information and see if it gets back to Voss. Samuel nodded slowly. The telegram. We send Henry Brennan a message about our route, but we have Ridley send a different message, something only he would know. If Voss acts on both pieces of information, we know Ridley's compromised. And if he's not? Elizabeth asked. Then we apologize and hope he forgives us for doubting him. Samuel checked the sky through the gaps in the bunkhouse roof. We've got about 3 hours until Ridley's due back. Doc, can you ride down and meet him? Tell him the plan. See his reaction. If something feels wrong, trust your instincts. Doc stood, his old bones creaking. "And what will you two be doing?" "Getting the rest of the supplies ready and figuring out exactly what's in that bank box, because we might need to know what we're fighting for." After Doc left, Samuel and Elizabeth worked in comfortable silence, checking gear, inventorying ammunition, planning for contingencies. The familiarity of it brought back memories of working with James. Those quiet moments before a dangerous operation when everything had to be perfect because mistakes cost lives. "He talked about you," Elizabeth said suddenly. "James, all the time, actually. How you were the best tracker he'd ever seen. How you could read people like books. How you never let emotion cloud your judgment." He was generous in his praise. He was honest. She paused in her work, looking at Samuel with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "He also told me once that if anything ever happened to him, I should find you. That you were the one person he'd trust with my life. Elizabeth, I need you to know something." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the silver threaded through her dark hair, the lines that 20 years of hardship had carved into her face. "When James and I married, I cared for him deeply. Loved him, even. But there was someone else I thought about sometimes, late at night when James was away on assignment. Someone who never said anything, never crossed a line, but whose eyes held things that words couldn't express." Samuel felt his throat tighten. "That's the past, is it? Because right now, standing here, I feel like I'm 25 again and trying to figure out why my heart beats faster when you look at me." Before Samuel could respond, Doc's voice called from outside, urgent and sharp. "Samuel, we've got trouble." They rushed out to find Doc dismounting from his horse, Ridley right behind him. But Ridley wasn't alone. He had someone thrown over his saddle, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. "Found him about a mile down the trail," Ridley said, carefully lowering the man to the ground. "He was watching your cabin with field glasses. When I approached to question him, he ran. Chased him down, and during the struggle he fell and hit his head on a rock." Samuel recognized the face one of Voss's men, though not Pike or the other two who'd ridden with Dixon. This was someone new, which meant Voss had more resources deployed than they'd realized. "Did he see where Doc was heading?" Samuel asked. "Don't know. Maybe." Ridley looked shaken. "Samuel, I need to show you something." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a telegram already sent. "This came through the telegraph office this afternoon. I saw it because Jake Morrison's brother operates the telegraph, and he thought it was suspicious enough to mention." Samuel unfolded the telegram, feeling ice form in his gut as he read. It was addressed to Clayton Voss, signed with the initials Terror Tom Ridley. The message was brief but devastating. "Package located at old mining camp north of coal property. Awaiting instructions." The silence stretched thin and dangerous as everyone processed what this meant. Finally, Samuel looked up at Ridley, his hand resting on his sidearm. "This one of your tests?" Ridley asked quietly, "Giving me false information to see if I pass it along?" "No," Samuel said, "because we didn't tell you we were here. But I figured it out. Wasn't hard Doc heading north with supplies. You asking me to gather more gear. I put it together." Ridley met Samuel's eyes steadily. "And then I sent that telegram to make Voss think I was working for him." "Why would you do that?" "Because I've been working for Voss for 3 months now." Ridley's words fell like stones into still water. "He approached me last spring, offered me money to keep him informed about land deals, who was planning to sell, who might need convincing. Said it was just business intelligence. I took it because the sheriff's pay is terrible and my family needed the money." Samuel's hand tightened on his gun. "You sold us out." "I sold information about land," Ridley corrected. "But then I realized what Voss was really doing. The intimidation, the threats, people leaving town in the middle of the night. I tried to stop, told him I was out. He said I was in too deep, that he had written proof of my cooperation. And if I didn't keep working for him, he'd make sure I was charged as an accomplice to everything he'd done. So you send him that telegram. I sent him a telegram that will make him deploy his men to a location I specified. The coordinates I gave are actually 3 miles east of here, in rough terrain where they'll be spread thin and easy to spot. Ridley's voice took on an edge of desperate sincerity. I'm trying to buy you time, Mr. Cole, and maybe earn back some of the honor I sold off for $200 a month. Elizabeth stepped forward. How do we know you're telling the truth now? Ridley pulled something else from his pocket, a small leather journal. This is my insurance. Every payment Voss made to me, every order he gave, every crime he admitted to in our conversations. I documented all of it. Dates, amounts, witnesses when there were any. It's not enough to hang him on its own, but combined with whatever evidence Mrs. Caldwell has, it might be enough. Samuel took the journal, flipping through pages of careful handwriting. Detailed notes that read like a confession and an accusation rolled into one. If this was fabricated, it was the most elaborate deception he'd ever seen. Why not come forward before? Doc asked. Because I was scared. Still am, if I'm being honest. Ridley's voice cracked slightly. But then I saw what they did to Mrs. Caldwell, how they've been hunting her. And I realized I'd become exactly the kind of man my father raised me not to be. So I'm here, showing you everything and hoping you'll let me help fix what I helped break. Samuel made a decision. All right, but you follow my lead, and if I even suspect you're playing us, I'll put a bullet through you myself. Clear, crystal. Then here's what we're going to do. Samuel gathered them close. The unconscious guard lying nearby as an uncomfortable reminder of how little time they had. We're still going to Cheyenne, but we're changing everything. The route, the timing, the whole plan. Ridley, you're going to send another telegram, telling Voss you made a mistake about the location. Keep him chasing ghosts. Doc, you're going back to town to send Henry Brennan a coded message, something only he would understand, telling him we need his help accessing that bank box without being seen. And Elizabeth, he pulled out James's silver compass. You're taking this. She looked at the compass, then at Samuel. Why? Because James gave it to me to keep me heading in the right direction. Now I'm giving it to you to do the same. True north, always. No matter what happens, we stay on course. Elizabeth took the compass, her fingers closing around it. What if true north leads us somewhere we can't come back from? Then we make sure it was worth the journey. Samuel looked at each of them in turn. Elizabeth with her scarred face and survivor's eyes. Doc with his quiet strength and unshakable integrity. Ridley with his fear and desperate hope for redemption. We've got one chance to bring down Clayton Voss. One chance to get justice for James and everyone else he's destroyed. So we make it count. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Somewhere out there, Clayton Voss was moving his pieces on the board, confident in his power and reach. But he didn't know that the game had just changed, that the prey had become hunters, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one who had nothing left to lose. Samuel Cole was done running. It was time to fight. They rode through the night, picking their way through terrain that would have been treacherous in full daylight and became positively deadly in darkness. Samuel led, using moonlight and instinct to navigate the narrow trails that wound through the Absaroka Range. Elizabeth rode behind him, then Ridley, with Doc bringing up the rear. They'd left the unconscious guard tied securely at the mining camp with enough water to survive until someone found him. Samuel wouldn't kill a man in cold blood, but he wouldn't risk their mission either. The high country was beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Pine forests gave way to bare rock faces, then back to scattered stands of aspen whose leaves whispered secrets in the wind. The temperature dropped steadily as they climbed, and by midnight they were all wearing their heaviest coats. breath misting in the cold air. They stopped twice to rest the horses, never for more than 30 minutes. Samuel used the breaks to study their back trail, watching for any signs of pursuit. So far, nothing. Either Ridley's misdirection had worked, or Voss's men were better at tracking than Samuel gave them credit for. He preferred to assume the worst and hope for the best. During the second stop, Elizabeth pulled out the bundle of letters she'd been carrying in her saddlebag. Samuel had noticed them earlier, but hadn't asked some things were too private to question. Now, with the moon bright overhead and hours of dangerous riding still ahead, she began reading them aloud. "James wrote this 3 weeks before he died," she said softly, unfolding yellowed paper with careful reverence. "He was on assignment, tracking some cattle rustlers near a Montana border." Her voice carried across the quiet mountainside as she read, "My dearest Elizabeth, tonight I'm camped under stars, so bright they seem close enough to touch. It reminds me of our wedding night, when you pointed out the constellations and told me their stories. You always saw beauty in things I overlooked. That's your gift, and one of the 1,000 reasons I love you. This work takes me away too often, and I know that weighs on you. But I need you to know something. If anything ever happens to me, if I don't come home, you must promise to keep living. Find joy again. Find love again, if you can. Don't let my death be your prison." Samuel felt something crack open in his chest. He'd known James was a good man, but hearing his words after 20 years, knowing he'd sensed his own mortality and still thought of Elizabeth's future, it was almost too much. Elizabeth's voice caught on the next words. "He wrote about you, Samuel. Listen, if you're reading this because the worst has happened, seek out Samuel Cole. He's the best man I know, though he'd never admit it. He's also halfway in love with you, though he'd deny that even more vigorously. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. I'm not threatened by, I'm comforted. If I can't be there to protect you, Samuel will. Trust him with your life. Trust him with your heart, if it comes to that. He won't fail you." The silence that followed was profound. Samuel couldn't look at her, couldn't look at any of them. He stared at the mountains, at the vast sweep of stars overhead. Anywhere but at the woman who just revealed that his oldest friend had known his most carefully guarded secret. "He knew," Samuel said finally. "All along he knew. Yes." Elizabeth folded the letter carefully. "And he loved you anyway. Loved us both. I know. You never said anything. Never acted on it. That's who you are, Samuel. A man who keeps his promises even when they cost him everything." She moved closer until she was standing right beside him. "But James released us both from those promises. He gave us permission to be happy, if we can figure out what that means." Ridley cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe we should discuss this after we're not being hunted?" It broke the tension enough that Elizabeth laughed, a real laugh, free and genuine. The first Samuel had heard from her. "The young sheriff has a point. Romance can wait. Survival comes first." But as they mounted up and continued their journey, Samuel felt the weight of the compass in his pocket differently now. It wasn't just a reminder of duty or a symbol of navigation. It was a gift from a friend who'd seen the future more clearly than Samuel ever had, and who'd tried to give them both a map to find their way home. The sun rose as they descended into Wind River Canyon, painting the rock walls in shades of amber and gold. They'd made good time, better than Samuel had hoped, but they were all exhausted. The horses needed rest, and so did they. He found a sheltered spot near a stream where they could water the animals and catch a few hours of sleep in shifts. Doc volunteered for first watch. As the others settled in, he pulled Samuel aside. "You need to prepare yourself for what comes next," the old doctor said. "Getting to Cheyenne is one thing. Getting those documents and getting out alive is something else entirely. I know. Do you? Because I've been thinking about this. Voss isn't stupid. Even if Ridley's misdirection worked, Voss will have guards at the bank. He knows that's where Elizabeth has to go eventually. It's his strongest position. Samuel had been thinking the same thing. Then we don't go through the front door. What's your plan? Working on it. Samuel watched Elizabeth sleep, her face finally relaxed, free of the tension that had defined every waking moment since she'd arrived. But whatever we do, she can't be part of it. If something goes wrong, I won't have her captured again. She won't agree to that. I'm not asking for agreement. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Samuel's voice carried steel. James asked me to protect her. That's what I'm going to do, even if she hates me for it. Doc sighed. You're a stubborn man, Samuel Cole. Yes, I am. They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne 2 days later, approaching from the west as planned. The city sprawled across the prairie like a promise of civilization in the wilderness, wooden buildings giving way to brick and stone. Streets laid out in orderly grids, the sound of industry and commerce carrying on the wind. Samuel had been here a dozen times during his marshal days, and it never failed to feel both foreign and familiar. They bypassed the main roads, circling around to approach from the side where fewer eyes would mark their arrival. Henry Brennan had sent word back through Doc's contact that he'd arranged a safe house, a small cabin on the edge of town owned by a widow, who asked no questions and remembered nothing. They arrived there just after dark, stabling the horses in a lean-to that had seen better days. Inside, Henry was waiting. He was Martha's brother-in-law, but the family resemblance was minimal. Where Martha was sturdy and practical, Henry was slight and nervous, with quick movements and eyes that never stayed still. But Samuel saw intelligence in those eyes, and the careful way he'd arranged the cabin for their arrival spoke of competence. Mrs. Caldwell, Henry said, recognizing Elizabeth immediately. I remember you from 20 years ago. You came through Cheyenne with Marshal Caldwell a few times. I was just a clerk back then, fresh off the boat from Philadelphia. Mr. Brennan, thank you for helping us. Martha wouldn't have it any other way. And besides, I've got my own reasons for wanting to see Clayton Voss taken down. He's been pressuring the land office to rush through his acquisitions, threatening anyone who slows the process. Henry spread maps and documents across the table. Now, the bank where your deposit box is located. First National has been under Voss's influence for about 8 months. He made them a substantial loan when they were struggling, and now he essentially owns them. So walking in the front door is suicide, Samuel said. Essentially, yes. There are guards, at least 2, watching the main entrance. They're looking for Mrs. Caldwell specifically, but they'll notice anyone who seems suspicious. Henry pointed to a detailed map of the bank's layout. However, there may be another way. He explained. The bank had recently expanded, adding a new vault in the basement. The construction had required drilling through to the city's storm drainage system, and while the hole had been sealed with iron bars, Henry had learned from his position at the land office that the bars were installed incorrectly. They could be removed from the inside. The storm drains are accessible through several grates around the city. Henry continued. Most are locked, but I happen to know that the one behind the livery stable has a broken lock. The city keeps meaning to fix it, but never gets around to it. From there, it's about 200 yards of crawling through drainage tunnels, but you'd come up directly beneath the bank's basement. Samuel studied the map, already seeing problems. The deposit boxes aren't in the basement. They're on the main floor in the secondary vault. True, but the basement has access stairs that lead to the main floor. There's a guard station at the top, but only one guard, and he makes rounds every hour. If you time it right, you'd have maybe 10 minutes to get to the deposit boxes. Retrieve what you need and get back down before anyone notices. That's a lot of ifs, Ridley said. It's the only option that doesn't involve a frontal assault, Henry replied, and I've studied the bank's schedule. Tomorrow is the 1st of the month. They'll be busy with account settlements, more customers than usual. More chaos means more opportunity. Elizabeth had been quiet during the explanation, but now she spoke up. I'm the only one who can access the deposit box. It's under a false name, but I established the security questions. If anyone else tries, they'll sound an alarm. Then you're coming with me, Samuel said. No. Elizabeth's voice was firm. You're going to tell me there's too much risk, that I should stay here while you handle it. But those documents are my responsibility, my burden. I won't let anyone else carry it. They locked eyes across the table, and Samuel saw the determination there, the steel that had kept her alive for 20 years of running. She wasn't the frightened woman who collapsed in Cedar Ridge. She was a survivor, who'd made a choice to stop surviving and start fighting. All right, he said finally. But we do this my way. You follow my lead, and if I say run, you run. Understood? Understood. They spent the rest of the evening planning every detail. Henry provided a detailed schedule of the guard rotations, the names of the bank employees who could be bribed versus those who were loyal to Voss, and the location of every exit. Doc prepared a medical kit. He'd be waiting nearby in case things went wrong. Ridley would be watching the street, ready to create a distraction if needed. As midnight approached, Samuel found himself alone with Elizabeth on the cabin's small porch. The city lights spread out before them, golden against the darkness, and somewhere in those lights, Clayton Voss was waiting, confident in his power and control. Are you afraid? Elizabeth asked quietly. Yes. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you careful. James used to say the same thing. She pulled out the silver compass, watching it catch the lamplight from inside. He also said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act despite it. He was full of wisdom, James. He was full of love. Elizabeth turned to face Samuel. For the job, for justice, for his friends. For me, and I loved him for it. Truly I did. But Samuel, I need you to know something before we walk into that bank tomorrow. If we don't make it out, we'll make it out. If we don't, she continued firmly, I need you to know that these past few days with you have been the first time in 20 years I felt like I was living instead of just existing. You gave me that. You gave me hope again. Samuel wanted to say something profound, something worthy of the moment. Instead, he just took her hand and held it, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of her survival. Words felt inadequate anyway. They stayed like that until Doc called them inside for a final review of the plan. Tomorrow they would descend into the darkness beneath the city, retrieve the evidence that could bring down Clayton Voss, and either emerge victorious or not emerge at all. There was no middle ground anymore, no compromise or half measures. Samuel checked his weapons one last time before trying to sleep. His service revolver, cleaned and loaded. A knife in his boot. And James's badge, which he'd brought from the cabin, tucked in his shirt pocket over his heart. If he was going to finish the job James had started, he wanted his partner's badge with him. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of fire and darkness, of James's face telling him to protect Elizabeth, of Pike's scarred face grinning as he reached for his gun. Samuel woke several times in a cold sweat, checking to make sure Elizabeth was still sleeping safely in the other room. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly at the same time. They ate a silent breakfast, each lost in their own thoughts about what the day would bring. Henry arrived with final updates. The guards had changed shifts at 6, and the new ones were less experienced. The bank would open at 8, and by 9 it would be crowded with customers. That was their window. At 7:30, Samuel and Elizabeth made their way through the awakening city to the livery stable. The great Henry had mentioned was exactly where he said it would be, hidden behind a stack of old hay bales. The lock was indeed broken, though someone had tried to wire it shut. Samuel's knife made quick work of the wire. The grate lifted with a rusty squeal that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. Below, darkness waited, The storm drain system that would either deliver them to their goal or become their tomb. "Last chance to change your mind," Samuel said. Elizabeth checked the compass one more time, then pocketed it. "True north, remember? We keep going forward." She descended into the darkness first, finding the metal rung set into the wall. Samuel followed, pulling the grate closed above them. The smell hit him immediately: damp stone, standing water, and the peculiar must of spaces that never saw sunlight. His eyes adjusted slowly, aided by thin shafts of light that filtered down through other grates along the tunnel. They moved carefully, Samuel counting paces to match Henry's directions. The tunnel was about 4 feet high, forcing them to crouch and occasionally crawl. Water ran in a channel down the center, not deep but cold and likely contaminated. Twice they heard voices from above, people going about their morning routines, unaware of the drama unfolding beneath their feet. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached the section beneath the bank. The iron bars Henry had mentioned were visible above, set into what looked like a small alcove in the tunnel ceiling. Samuel tested them carefully, and sure enough, they'd been installed backwards. The securing bolts were accessible from this side. He worked quickly, removing the bolts and lowering the bars as quietly as possible. The opening beyond was narrow, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Samuel went first, pulling himself up into what appeared to be a storage room in the bank's basement. Dusty crates and old ledgers were stacked against the walls. A single door led, presumably, to the stairs Henry had mentioned. He helped Elizabeth up, then replaced the bars loosely in case they needed a quick escape. Together, they moved to the door and listened. Footsteps overhead, the murmur of voices, the sound of the bank coming to life. And underneath it all, the ticking of a clock, time running out with every second. Samuel checked his watch. 8:15. They had maybe 45 minutes before the guard's next rounds brought him to the basement level. Not much time, but it would have to be enough. He opened the door slowly, revealing a narrow staircase leading upward. At the top, another door, and beyond that, the main floor of the bank where Clayton Voss's men would be waiting, where Elizabeth's salvation or damnation lay locked in a deposit box, where 20 years of running was about to end one way or another. "Ready?" Samuel whispered. Elizabeth's hand found his in the darkness. "Ready." They climbed the stairs together, stepping into the light and the danger and the unknown future that waited beyond. The guard station at the top of the basement stairs was empty, just as Henry had predicted. Through the door's small window, Samuel could see a slice of the main banking floor: marble counters, brass fixtures, and customers conducting their business with the efficient calm of people who believed themselves safe in civilization's embrace. They had no idea that justice and vengeance were about to collide, just feet away from their morning transactions. Samuel counted heads quickly. 3 tellers behind the main counter, a manager at a desk near the front windows, and 2 men who were definitely not customers. They stood near the entrance, scanning faces with the focused attention of hunters who'd been given a description of their prey. Voss's men, just as expected. "The deposit boxes are in that alcove on the right," Elizabeth whispered, pointing to a recessed area partially hidden from the main floor. "We'll be exposed for maybe 15 feet crossing from here to there." "Wait for the distraction," Samuel said, checking his watch. 8:20. Ridley should be in position. As if summoned by the thought. The sound of shouting erupted from somewhere outside the bank. Then came the unmistakable crack of a gunshot fired into the air. Samuel hoped not at anyone, and the 2 guards at the entrance immediately moved to investigate, pushing through the doors to see what was happening. "Now," Samuel said. And they moved. Crossing those 15 feet felt like crossing an open battlefield. Samuel kept his body between Elizabeth and the main floor, one hand on his gun, every sense screaming warnings. But the remaining bank employees were too focused on the commotion. outside to notice two figures slipping into the deposit box alcove. The room was smaller than Samuel had imagined, maybe 10 feet square, with walls lined with brass-faced boxes of various sizes. Each had a number and a keyhole. Elizabeth went immediately to box 237, her hands surprisingly steady as she produced a key from inside her dress. "I'll need to answer security questions," she said quietly. "Stay alert." She pressed a small button beside the box, and within seconds, a bank clerk appeared, a thin man in his 50s with spectacles and the nervous demeanor of someone who'd spent his life avoiding confrontation. He glanced at Samuel with concern, but addressed Elizabeth. "Name on the account?" "Mary Sullivan." "Date of opening?" "March 15th, 1881. "Security phrase?" "True North always," Elizabeth said, and Samuel felt something tighten in his chest at her choice of words. The clerk nodded, produced a second key, and together with Elizabeth's key, opened the deposit box. He slid out a long metal container and handed it to her. "Will you be conducting your business here, or do you need privacy?" "We're fine here, thank you," Elizabeth said with remarkable composure. The clerk retreated, and Elizabeth opened the container with shaking hands. Inside were papers, dozens of them, carefully organized and preserved. Ledgers documenting illegal land transactions. Sworn statements from witnesses who'd seen Silas Voss commit murder. Letters proving coordination between Voss and corrupt officials. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, something that made Samuel's breath catch. It was a marshal's badge. James's original badge, the one he'd been wearing the night he died. "Pike took this from his body," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. "Wore it as a trophy for months. I stole it back when I escaped. Wanted James to have something of himself if I ever found his grave." Samuel picked up the badge carefully, feeling the weight of it, seeing the dents and scratches that told their own story of violence and loss. He thought of his own badge, retired and hanging on his cabin wall, and of James's badge that he carried over his heart. 3 badges for 3 marshals, 2 of whom had failed to save the people they'd sworn to protect. "Not this time," Samuel promised silently. "This time, the story ends differently." "We've got everything," Elizabeth said, carefully repacking the documents into a leather satchel she brought. "Let's go before." The clerk's scream cut her off. Samuel spun to see one of Voss's guards back inside, gun drawn and pointed directly at them. The guard from outside must have realized the distraction was exactly that and sent his partner back to watch the bank. "Don't move," the guard ordered. He was young, maybe 25, with the overeager intensity of someone trying to prove himself. "Put the bag down and step away from it." Samuel calculated angles and distances with the speed of long experience. The guard was 15 feet away, partially exposed, his gun steady, but his stance slightly wrong way too far forward, which meant his balance was compromised. One good shot could take him down, but the noise would bring every guard in a 2-block radius running, and they'd never make it back to the basement. "Easy now," Samuel said, raising his hand slowly. "No need for anyone to get hurt. That's not your decision." The guard's eyes flicked to Elizabeth. "You're Margaret Sutton. Clayton Voss wants you alive, but he didn't say anything about your friend here." The gun shifted towards Samuel, and in that instant, when the guard's attention divided between 2 targets, Elizabeth moved. She grabbed a brass letter opener from the clerk's desk and threw it in a single fluid motion, not at the guard, but at the overhead lamp beside him. The lamp shattered, raining glass and oil down on the guard. He flinched, firing reflexively, but his shot went wide, burying itself in the wall behind them. Samuel didn't waste the opportunity. He closed the distance in 3 strides and drove his shoulder into the guard's midsection, taking him down hard. They hit the marble floor together, Samuel's hand clamping around the guard's wrist, forcing the gun away. The younger man was strong and desperate, fighting with everything he had. They rolled, crashed into a counter, sent papers flying. Samuel got a knee up, used it for leverage, and finally managed to slam the guard's hand against the floor hard. Enough that the gun clattered away. One punch to the jaw. Precisely placed, and the guard went limp. Samuel grabbed the gun and the satchel, pulled Elizabeth toward the basement door. Behind them, shouts erupted as people realized something was wrong. The second guard would be inside in seconds, and then they'd be trapped. They hit the basement stairs at a run. The basement storage room seemed impossibly far away, though it was only 30 feet down the corridor. Samuel heard boots thundering on the stairs above them, multiple men now, all converging on their location. He slammed the storage room door shut and shoved a heavy crate against it. It wouldn't hold long, but they only needed seconds. Elizabeth was already at the opening, pulling away the iron bars. Samuel helped her drop through first, then passed down the satchel. The door behind them shook with impact, someone ramming it with their shoulder. Wood splintered. Samuel dropped through the opening just as the door burst open. He landed badly, his ankle twisting, pain shooting up his leg. No time to worry about it. He pulled the bars back into place as the first guard reached the opening and peered down into the darkness. They're in the tunnels. Get men to the other grates. Samuel and Elizabeth ran, or rather Samuel hobbled as fast as he could, while Elizabeth supported half his weight. The tunnel seemed longer going back, the darkness more oppressive, the sound of pursuit echoing behind them magnified by the enclosed space. He could hear men dropping into the tunnel, hear their shouts as they tried to track which direction their quarry had gone. They reached an intersection. Samuel didn't remember from the trip-in. Which way? Elizabeth gasped. Samuel tried to orient himself, but pain and adrenaline were scrambling his usually reliable sense of direction. He closed his eyes, forced himself to think clearly. The livery stable had been west of the bank. Water in the drainage system flowed from east to west, following the natural slope of the land. That meant left, he said with more confidence than he felt. They took the left tunnel, moving as quickly as Samuel's injured ankle would allow. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit seemed to be getting closer. Either Voss's men were faster, or they knew shortcuts Samuel didn't. Neither possibility was encouraging. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where 3 drainage channels converged, and there, standing in a shaft of light from a grate above, was Pike. The scarred man held a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other, and his smile was everything evil and satisfied. End of the line, Pike said conversationally. I have to admit, you made it farther than I expected, Cole. But Clayton Voss always gets what he wants. Always. Samuel pushed Elizabeth behind him, his hand on his revolver. You're the one who took James's badge, who wore it after you murdered him. Guilty as charged. Though it wasn't murder, it was business. James Caldwell couldn't leave well enough alone, kept digging into things that didn't concern him. Silas paid me well to make sure he didn't dig any deeper. And Elizabeth? What was your business with her? Pike's smile widened. That was pleasure more than business. Silas wanted her kept alive in case there was evidence we missed, but he gave me free rein on how I kept her. I enjoyed those months, Cole. Enjoyed breaking her spirit piece by piece. Samuel felt rage building, cold and controlled. You failed. She's still standing, for now. Pike raised the rifle. Drop your gun, or I shoot her first and then you. Your choice. Samuel's mind raced through options. Pike was maybe 20 feet away. Good range for the rifle, but his stance was casual, overconfident. The lantern in his left hand would affect his balance. And the tunnel behind Pike curved. If Samuel could get him to turn, even slightly, it might create an opening. The evidence is already out, Samuel said, playing for time. We sent copies to federal marshals before coming here. Killing us changes nothing. Nice bluff, but Clayton already thought of that. He's got people watching every telegraph office, every stagecoach, every possible way you could have sent information. Nothing got out. You're alone, Cole, and you're going to die alone." "Not alone," Elizabeth said quietly, and Samuel felt her press something into his hand. James's badge, the one from the deposit box. Samuel understood immediately. The badge was heavy, solid brass and steel. He palmed it, feeling its weight, calculating trajectory. He'd need Pike to turn, just for a second, and then, "You know what I regret most?" Samuel said, taking a small step forward. "That James never got to face you himself. He would have enjoyed it." "James died crying for his wife," Pike sneered, "begging me to spare her." "It was pathetic. You're lying." Elizabeth's voice shook with rage. "James never begged for anything. Ask him yourself when you see him in hell." Pike's finger tightened on the trigger, and Samuel threw the badge with every ounce of strength and precision he possessed. It spun through the air, catching lantern light, and struck Pike's hand just as the rifle fired. The shot went wild, sparking off the tunnel wall. Pike staggered back, dropping the lantern. And Samuel was already moving despite his injured ankle. He closed the distance before Pike could recover, driving his fist into the scarred man's face with 20 years of pent-up rage behind it. They went down together into the shallow water, trading blows, fighting with the desperate intensity of men who knew only one of them would walk away. Pike was younger and stronger, but Samuel had experience and motivation. When Pike tried to reach for a knife at his belt, Samuel grabbed his wrist and slammed it against the stone floor until the fingers went slack. When Pike tried to gouge at his eyes, Samuel headbutted him, feeling the satisfying crunch of cartilage. But Pike got a hand on Samuel's throat, squeezing, cutting off air. Samuel's vision started to narrow, darkness creeping in at the edges. He could hear Elizabeth shouting, could feel her trying to pull Pike away, but the man's grip was iron. Samuel's hand fumbled at his belt, found his own knife, pulled it free. He drove it upward, feeling resistance, then a sudden give as the blade found its mark between Pike's ribs. The man's eyes went wide with shock and pain. His grip loosened. "For James," Samuel gasped, "and for every person you hurt." Pike slumped sideways into the water, blood spreading in dark clouds. Samuel pushed him away and gulped air, his throat burning. Elizabeth was beside him, helping him stand. And together they grabbed the satchel and stumbled toward what Samuel desperately hoped was the way out. They found the livery stable grate more by luck than navigation. Emerging into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the tunnel's darkness, Samuel pulled the grate closed, and they staggered away. Two broken figures carrying the weight of evidence that would bring down an empire. Dotbog was waiting where he'd promised, 2 blocks away with a wagon. He took one look at them, bloodied, soaked, barely standing, and asked no questions. He simply helped them into the back and covered them with canvas. "Ridley's creating more distractions," Doc said quietly. "We should have a clear run to the edge of town. After that, it's up to how fast these horses can move." As the wagon lurched forward, Samuel felt Elizabeth's hand find his. They lay side by side under the canvas, breathing hard, listening to the sounds of the city falling away behind them. Against all odds, they'd succeeded. They had the evidence. They were alive. But Clayton Voss was still out there, and Samuel knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 3 months later, autumn had settled over Cedar Ridge with the gentle finality of a chapter closing. Samuel stood on his porch, watching the aspens turn gold against the deep green of the pines, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. The view was the same as it had been for 20 years, but everything else had changed. The cabin looked different now. Larger, with the addition nearly complete. Townspeople had volunteered their labor neighbors Samuel barely knew, grateful for what he'd done, eager to help build something that represented hope rather than isolation. The new sign above the door, hand-carved by Henry Brennan himself. Read Cole and Caldwell in simple, honest letters. Not quite married yet, though the intent was clear. Elizabeth had insisted on waiting until the legal matters were fully resolved, until Clayton Voss was convicted and sentenced. "I want to start our life together with a clean slate," she'd said. "No shadows, no threats, just us and the future we choose." That future was coming faster than Samuel had expected. The trial had concluded 2 weeks ago, held in the territorial capital with federal judges presiding. The evidence from Elizabeth's deposit box, combined with Ridley's journal and testimony from witnesses who finally felt safe enough to speak, had been overwhelming. Clayton Voss was convicted on 17 counts, including murder, conspiracy, land fraud, and witness intimidation. He'd been sentenced to hang, though appeals would likely drag on for months. Samuel didn't care about the timeline. Justice delayed was still justice, and knowing that Voss would spend the rest of his life in a cell was satisfaction enough. The cost had been high. Marshall Dixon, who'd been cooperating with Voss more than he'd admitted, had been stripped of his badge and faced charges of his own. Several local officials had been implicated and removed from office. The banking institution in Cheyenne had nearly collapsed under the scandal, saved only by federal intervention and new management. But good had come from the chaos. New laws protecting homesteaders had been passed. A federal oversight commission was investigating land transactions across the territory. And Cedar Ridge, once a quiet backwater, had become a symbol of ordinary people standing up against corruption and winning. Samuel heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Elizabeth emerge from the cabin. She'd put on weight in the past months, the gauntness of constant fear replaced by healthy strength. The bruises and scars remained, but they no longer defined her. She'd taken to helping Doc with his practice, her steady hands and calm demeanor making her a natural healer. People in town had started calling her Mrs. Cole already, and neither she nor Samuel corrected them. "Doc's here," she said, joining him at the railing. With news, apparently. Doc Hartley rode up the trail moments later, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd earned every one of his 70-odd years. He dismounted stiffly and accepted the coffee Elizabeth brought out without being asked. "Federal Marshal Service sent word," Doc said without preamble. "They're offering you a position, Samuel. Full reinstatement of rank, pension benefits backdated, and a formal apology for how the original investigation was handled." Samuel had been expecting something like this. The Marshals had been embarrassed by how thoroughly corruption had infiltrated their ranks 20 years ago, and now they were eager to make amends. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd deliver the message, and you give them an answer when you were ready." Doc sipped his coffee. "What are you going to say?" Samuel looked out at the mountains, at the valley spreading below, at the life he'd built from isolation and grief. Then he looked at Elizabeth, seeing the question in her eyes. "I'm going to say thank you for the offer, but no," Samuel said. "I wore that badge for 10 years, and it cost me everything that mattered. I'm done living for duty. It's time I lived for something else." Elizabeth's smile was like sunrise breaking over the peaks. "And what would that be?" "A quiet life, a shared life, maybe even a happy life, if we can figure out what that looks like." He pulled her close, feeling the rightness of it, the sense of pieces finally falling into place. "James told you to find joy again. I think it's time we both took his advice." Doc nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a man who's learned something. Which reminds me, Martha Brennan asked me to extend a dinner invitation. Tomorrow evening, if you're available. She's making pot roast." "We'll be there," Elizabeth said. "Tell her thank you." After Doc left, Samuel and Elizabeth walked the perimeter of the property, checking fence lines and water sources the way couples did when building a life together. They talked about practical things, where to plant the garden come spring, whether they needed more chickens, how to winterize the addition before the first heavy snows. Normal conversations about a normal future, unremarkable in the best possible way. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they sat together on a bench Samuel had built overlooking the valley. Elizabeth pulled out James's silver compass, which she now carried everywhere. "Do you think he'd approve?" she asked. "Of us, I mean." "I know he would. He told us as much in that letter. Still feels strange sometimes, like we're betraying his memory." "We're honoring it," Samuel said firmly. "We're living the life he wanted for us, the one he gave us permission to have. There's no betrayal in that." Elizabeth opened the compass, watching the needle swing to north. True north, always. That's what he believed in. Finding your direction and following it no matter how hard the journey. "And you found yours?" "I did." She closed the compass and took Samuel's hand. "It led me here. To you." "To home?" The words settled over them both with the weight of truth finally spoken. Home. Not just a place, but a person. A choice. A commitment to build something lasting from the wreckage of the past. In town below, lights were beginning to appear as families gathered for evening meals. Martha Brennan was probably preparing tomorrow's pot roast. Doc Hartley was making his rounds, checking on patients who'd become friends. Sheriff Ridley was walking Main Street, his journal of evidence having earned him the respect he'd always sought. Henry Brennan was closing up the land office, satisfied with a day's honest work, honestly done. And up in the mountains, Samuel Cole and Elizabeth Caldwell sat watching the sunset. Two people who'd survived the worst that life could throw at them and chosen to keep living anyway. The black veil that had concealed her face that first day was gone, burned in the same fire that had consumed her old identity. In its place was openness, vulnerability, the courage to be seen and known. "I can breathe now," Elizabeth said softly. "Really breathe. For the first time in 20 years. Samuel pulled her closer. "You're safe." "We both are. More than safe. We're free." And that, Samuel thought, was the real victory. Not the conviction or the vindication or the justice served. The real victory was this moment, this peace, this chance to begin again with someone who understood the cost of survival and the value of hope. The mountain stood eternal above them, witness to their new beginning. And as the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight, Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in 2 decades: contentment, simple and profound, settling into his bones like a benediction. The story that had begun with a veiled woman gasping for breath ended here, with 2 people breathing deeply of mountain air and possibility. True north had led them home at last, and the journey, for all its pain and cost, had been worth every step. Tomorrow they would go to Martha's for pot roast. Next week they would finalize wedding plans. Next spring they would plant that garden and watch it grow. The future stretched ahead, full of small moments and quiet joys. The kind of life that doesn't make headlines, but makes everything worthwhile. And somewhere, Samuel liked to think, James Caldwell was watching and smiling, satisfied that his final mission protecting the people he loved had finally been accomplished. The mountain whispered its approval in the evening wind. And Samuel Cole, former U.S. Marshal and current keeper of second chances, whispered back a simple truth. "We made it, old friend. We're home."